Something strange happens every time my security camera turns on. My dog freezes. Not like when a dog hears a noise and pauses for a second. I mean completely freezes. Mid-step, mid-breath, like someone pressed pause on him. At first I thought it was just bad timing. Maybe the camera turning on scared him for a moment. But then it kept happening. Every single time the red recording light activates, he stops moving. The camera only records when it detects motion. So usually it turns on when my dog walks through the living room at night. You see him enter the frame, the red light appears, and then suddenly, he freezes. One paw lifted in the air, body stiff, head slightly turned, and then nothing. He stays like that until the recording stops. The first time I noticed it, I laughed. I thought it was weird but harmless. Dogs do strange things sometimes. But after a few days, I started noticing something else. His eyes. His body never moves. Not even a blink. But if you zoom in on the footage, his eyes are still moving. Slowly, like he's watching something move across the room. The first time I saw that, I paused the video and replayed it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. His eyes move from left to right, slowly tracking something. But there's nothing there. The living room is empty. No person, no shadow, no movement. Just my dog standing frozen, staring at something I can't see. At first I assumed maybe there was a bug flying around or something small that the camera couldn't pick up. But the way his eyes moved didn't look like he was watching something flying. It looked like he was following something walking. Slow steps across the room. The strange part is where his eyes end up. Every time they stop at the exact same place, right behind the camera. That's when I started getting uncomfortable, because the camera is mounted on a shelf facing the living room. From the dog's perspective, whatever he's looking at isn't in the room. It would be standing directly behind the camera, exactly where someone would normally stand if they were watching the live feed. I told myself it was coincidence. Dogs stare at weird things all the time. But over the next week, the recordings kept piling up, and the pattern never changed. The red light turns on, my dog freezes. His eyes start moving, slowly tracking something behind the camera. Night after night. One recording from a few days later made things worse. This time he froze earlier than usual. The moment the camera activated, his body locked up instantly. But instead of calmly watching like before, his eyes started darting around the room, like he was nervous, like whatever he was watching had moved closer. Then something happened I had never seen before. His ears slowly lowered. Dogs do that when they're scared, but his body still didn't move. It was like he was terrified, but couldn't run. I checked the rest of the footage from that night, and something else stood out. After the camera stopped recording, he immediately ran out of the room. Not walked, ran. From that night forward, he refused to enter the living room after midnight. If I called him, he'd stop at the doorway and stare inside like something was in there with him. But eventually the camera would activate again. And when it did, the same thing happened. He froze, eyes tracking something behind the camera. A few nights ago, I decided to test something. I waited until the camera activated and opened the live feed on my phone. Then I stood exactly where the camera was mounted, right behind it. From that position, I looked at my dog. He was frozen like always, one paw lifted, body stiff. And then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. From where I was standing, his eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking slightly to the side of it, like whatever he was watching wasn't the camera itself. It was standing next to me. That thought stuck in my head all night. I tried convincing myself it was just paranoia. Maybe the angle was weird. Maybe dogs just stare at random things. But last night something happened that I can't explain. The camera activated again. My dog froze like always. I watched the footage this morning. His eyes started moving again, slowly following something behind the camera. But this time, they stopped. And then suddenly his eyes shifted directly toward the lens. Not slowly like before, instantly, like whatever he had been watching had just moved directly behind the camera, right where someone would be standing. The worst part is what happened next. My dog's body finally moved. Not running, not walking. He slowly backed away, still staring at the camera, like he was watching something standing right in front of it. Something I couldn't see. The camera kept recording for another 10 seconds. Then the footage ended. And there's one thing I noticed after replaying that clip. The camera only records when it detects motion. But my dog wasn't moving, so something else must have been. Something standing right behind the camera. And whatever it was, my dog could see it. I tried convincing myself the footage didn't mean anything. Dogs react to things humans can't see all the time. Maybe there was a sound the microphone couldn't pick up. Maybe it was a reflection or some strange camera glitch. But after that last clip, I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I started reviewing the older recordings again. Every single one. I went back weeks through the footage, watching every time the camera activated at night. The pattern was always the same. The red light turns on. My dog freezes. His eyes move, slowly following something behind the camera. But when I looked closer this time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The thing he was watching wasn't standing in the same place every night. It was moving. Not quickly, but slowly getting closer to the camera. In the earliest recordings, his eyes tracked something near the far corner behind the shelf where the camera is mounted. A few nights later, his eyes followed something closer. Then closer, like whatever it was had been slowly walking toward the camera over several nights, toward the exact place someone would stand if they were watching the feed. That realization made the entire situation feel wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Because if something was actually moving behind the camera should have recorded it. But it never did. It only ever recorded my dog, always frozen, always staring at something just out of frame. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2:30 in the morning, I opened the security camera app again. The house was completely quiet. The living room lights were off. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly, the red recording light appeared on the screen. The camera had activated again. My dog was already standing in the room. The moment the red light turned on, he froze. Exactly like always. One paw lifted slightly off the floor, body completely still. And then his eyes started moving, slowly tracking something behind the camera. Except this time, it felt different. His eyes weren't calmly following something across the room. They were slowly rising, like whatever he was watching was standing up or getting taller. My dog's ears slowly dropped against his head, that terrified posture again. And then something happened I had never seen before. He whimpered. A quiet sound, barely visible in the footage, but his mouth never moved. He was still frozen. The sound came from somewhere off screen, somewhere near the camera. Then my dog's eyes suddenly locked directly onto the lens. He wasn't following something anymore. He was staring straight at it, straight at the camera. For a moment, nothing moved. Then my dog slowly lowered his raised paw. Not running, not walking, just carefully placing it back on the floor, like he was afraid to move too fast. Then he backed away from the camera, step by step, still staring at it the entire time, his body shaking slightly. The camera kept recording, but something else must have moved, because the recording timer kept going longer than usual. Normally, the camera stops after a few seconds if there's no motion, but this time it kept recording. 30 seconds, 40 seconds, almost a full minute. My dog had already backed out of the room, but the camera was still detecting movement. Something was still moving near it. Then suddenly, the footage glitched. The image distorted for just a second, and for one single frame, something appeared on the screen. Not clearly, just a shape. Tall, standing extremely close to the camera, so close that it almost filled the entire frame. The footage corrected itself immediately after, but that single frame stayed burned into my mind. Because whatever that shape was, it wasn't facing my dog. It was facing the camera, facing directly toward the person watching the live feed, me. I replayed that frame over and over again this morning, trying to see it clearly, trying to convince myself it was just a glitch. But the longer I stared at it, the worse the feeling got. Because the shape didn't look like it had just walked into frame. It looked like it had been standing there the entire time, right behind the camera, exactly where someone would normally stand when watching the feed. And then I realized something else that made my stomach drop. Last night, I wasn't standing behind the camera. I was in my bedroom, watching the live feed from my phone, which means if something was standing there, watching the camera, watching my dog, it wasn't me. And right now, the camera app is open again. The red recording light just turned on, and my dog is already frozen in the living room. But this time, his eyes aren't following something behind the camera. They're staring directly into it, like whatever was standing there before isn't there anymore. Like it moved, like it left that spot and came somewhere else, somewhere closer, somewhere inside the house. I didn't move for a long time after watching that last recording. My phone was still in my hand. The camera app was still open. The red recording light was still glowing on the screen. And my dog was still frozen in the living room. But now his eyes weren't following anything behind the camera anymore. They were staring directly into the lens, like whatever he had been watching before had moved. At first I told myself it meant the thing was gone. Maybe it had left the house. Maybe the whole thing had just been some weird sequence of coincidences and shadows and my brain filling in the blanks. But my dog didn't relax. He stayed completely still, not blinking, not breathing, just staring. Then slowly, his eyes moved again. But this time they didn't move behind the camera. They moved past it, like he was watching something walk away from the camera, something walking deeper into the house. I felt my stomach drop when that thought crossed my mind, because the only place it could go from there was the hallway. The hallway that leads directly to my bedroom, where I was sitting, watching the live feed. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The camera was still recording even though my dog hadn't moved, which meant something else was still triggering the motion sensor. Something moving somewhere just outside the frame. Then the living room lights flickered slightly, just once. The kind of tiny flicker you'd normally ignore. But my dog's eyes snapped toward the hallway instantly, like something had just appeared there, something the camera couldn't see. His body still didn't move, but his eyes slowly followed something walking across the hallway entrance, tracking it carefully, watching it pass by. And then his eyes stopped, pointing directly down the hallway toward my bedroom. My chest tightened when I realized what that meant. Whatever he was watching was now standing somewhere in the hallway, facing my room. I slowly turned my head toward my bedroom door. It was open slightly, just enough to see the dark hallway outside. Nothing was there. The hallway light was off. Everything looked normal. But when I looked back down at my phone screen, my dog was still staring in that exact direction, frozen, eyes locked on the hallway, watching something that wasn't there. Then suddenly he did something I had never seen before. He slowly lowered his head, not in fear, not like before, but like he was avoiding eye contact, like dogs do when they don't want to challenge something bigger than them. And that's when the camera stopped recording. The red light disappeared. The footage ended. The room on my phone screen went still again. My dog immediately ran out of the living room, just like he had done the previous nights. But this time he didn't stop at the hallway. He ran straight past it, straight toward my bedroom, toward me. A second later, I heard his paws hitting the hallway floor outside my door. Fast, panicked. He slid into my room and jumped onto the bed beside me, breathing heavily, shaking. I had never seen him that scared before. He kept staring at the bedroom doorway, low growls rumbling quietly in his throat. I slowly looked toward the door. The hallway outside was still empty. Nothing there, no movement, no sound, just silence. After a few minutes, my dog finally relaxed enough to lie down beside me, but he never stopped watching the door. Even when he closed his eyes, his ears stayed pointed toward the hallway. Morning eventually came. Sunlight filled the house. Everything felt normal again. Too normal. I checked the security camera recordings one more time before leaving for work. The last clip from the night was still there. The one where my dog backed away from the camera while staring at something in front of it. But something about it looked different now. The recording had frozen at the final frame, and for the first time, I noticed something in the reflection of the TV screen behind my dog. A shape, tall, standing in the hallway entrance. The camera hadn't been facing that direction, but the reflection caught it. Just barely. A dark outline, long, unnaturally tall, and completely still, standing exactly where my dog had been staring, right outside the hallway, right outside my bedroom. I stared at that frame for a long time, trying to figure out how I could have missed it before. Then I noticed something that made my heart stop. The figure in the reflection wasn't facing my dog. It wasn't facing the living room. It was facing the hallway, facing directly toward my bedroom, facing the place where I had been sitting, watching the camera feed. And when I zoomed in on the reflection, I saw something else. The shape's head was slightly tilted, like it was listening, like it knew someone was watching. And the moment I realized that, my phone vibrated in my hand. A motion alert from the living room camera. I slowly opened the app again. The red recording light had just turned on. The living room was empty. No dog, no movement, nothing. But the camera was still recording, which means something in that room was moving. And then the camera slowly adjusted its exposure. The image brightened slightly, just enough for me to see the hallway entrance. And standing there, perfectly still, was the same tall shape from the reflection, facing directly toward the camera, facing directly toward me, like it had been waiting for me to look back. I couldn't move. The camera feed was still open on my phone, and the living room was completely silent. The tall shape stood in the hallway entrance, perfectly still, too still. It didn't sway like a person would. It didn't breathe. It didn't shift its weight. It just stood there, facing the camera, facing me. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just a trick of the lighting. Maybe the shadows in the hallway had formed something that looked like a person. But then it moved. Not a step, just its head, slowly tilting to the side, like it was studying the camera, studying me. A cold feeling ran through my chest, because the way it tilted its head looked familiar. My dog does that sometimes when he's confused, like he's trying to understand something. And whatever this thing was, it looked like it was trying to understand me. I stared at the screen, barely breathing. The camera was still recording, which meant the motion sensor was still detecting movement. But the thing in the hallway wasn't moving anymore. It had gone completely still again. And then I realized something. If the camera only records when something moves, then something else in that room must still be moving. Something the camera couldn't fully see. I turned the brightness on my phone up and stared harder at the screen. The living room looked empty. The couch, the table, the TV, the hallway, everything normal, except for that tall shape standing in the doorway. Then the image shifted slightly. Just a tiny adjustment as the camera corrected the lighting again. And that's when I saw it. The shadow behind the camera moved. Not the shadow of the camera, something else. Something standing between the camera and the living room. Something tall enough to cast a shadow across the floor. My hands started shaking, because that meant the thing in the hallway wasn't the only one there. Something else was in the room, right behind the camera, exactly where my dog had been staring all those nights. The tall figure in the hallway slowly lifted its head, and then, very slowly, it raised one arm. Not toward the living room, toward the camera, toward me, like it was pointing, like it was directing my attention behind the camera. The image suddenly distorted, just for a second. The same glitch from the previous night, and for a single frame the screen showed something else. A face, right up against the camera lens. Not human. The skin looked too pale, too stretched, eyes wide and empty, smiling. The image corrected immediately. The living room returned to normal. The hallway was empty. The tall figure was gone. The camera stopped recording. The red light disappeared. The feed ended. For a long time I sat there staring at the blank screen of my phone, trying to convince myself I hadn't actually seen that, trying to believe it was just a glitch, just a trick of the camera. But my dog slowly lifted his head from the bed beside me and looked toward the hallway. His ears flattened. A low growl started deep in his throat, and that's when I heard it, a soft sound from somewhere in the living room. A slow, quiet step, then another, moving across the floor, walking toward the hallway, walking toward my bedroom. My dog stood up on the bed, staring at the door, frozen, just like he had been in the recordings, completely still, except for his eyes, slowly moving, tracking something walking down the hallway, something getting closer to the door, something that had just left the living room, something that had just walked away from the camera.